that we're on Indigenous people space. We're in the middle of celebrating Diwali in the South Asian culture, so happy Diwali to everyone that's celebrating that and any other spiritual and community spaces that are happening. So this theme I'm really, really excited about. It's about healing. It's about really getting together, thinking about, particularly given the current cultural context that we are in, healing is very much necessary, and I would even say critical to our healing and success and growth and progress as a community. The panel is titled Feeling Community, Healing Community, and Building Solidarity. I'm honored to be the moderator today. We'll begin some quick introductions. First, we'll have Minerva Zayas from Eastern Washington University, and the talk is titled Beyond Labels and Boundaries, Queer Chicana Individuals and Psychological Identity Development. And I'm gonna give you a quick bio. Here we go. Minerva is a first-year master's student at Oregon State University in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Minerva graduated from Eastern Washington University as a Ronald E. McNair Scholar with her bachelor's degree in Women and Gender Studies and Psychology with a minor in Spanish. Her current research is on queer Chicana individuals and psychological identity development, shaped around the intersections of race, gender, and sexuality. She hopes to expand on her research interests in queer studies, critiques, and analysis, disability studies, queer people of color, and critical race and transnational feminisms. So welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I can take the microphone off here.
I think you can. And I'll read bios and descriptions as we go through so that we can remember.
Hello, everyone. My name is Minerva, and today I'm going to be presenting on Beyond Labels and Boundaries, Queer Chicana Individuals and Psychological Identity Development. So I've been working on this project for a couple of years already, and I'm hoping to one day get it published. I did it in my undergrad as a Ronald D. McNair Scholar through the mentorship of Dr. Jessica Willis, and I'm hoping to continue working on it at Oregon State as a grad student. My pronouns are she, her, hers, to begin with. So here I have a picture of myself. I was very privileged to be the cover of a symposium at Eastern Washington University, and I'm holding Sister Outsider, which is one of my favorite books. One of my favorite quotes to go along with this picture is, "And I began to recognize a source of power within myself that comes from the knowledge that while it is most desirable not to be afraid, learning to put fear into perspective gave me great strength." So this book has really accompanied me throughout my studies and development of my projects, and has continued to be central to when I want to, those days or moments where you feel like you need to re-energize from the social justice work that we are doing. So here I have accompanying Sister Outsider, Feminist Theory from Margin to Center and Borderlands, have also been books that have kind of driven my understanding of feminist theory. Bell Hooks, as we know, in the 1980s, was shut down as an African-American woman for speaking up for herself and saying African-American women and marginalized groups need a voice within academia. And as we know now, and within our current understanding of politics, that is still a problem today. So accompanying these other books, along with Anzaldua's Borderlands, La Frontera is what has shaped my understanding. Once again, Gloria Anzaldua's framework around borderlands and the mestiza consciousness, creating a dual identity and having to navigate two spaces, has been what has driven my research a little bit further, which I will go on and explain some more. So this project, as I mentioned, I did a couple of years ago. I did an IRB approval, so I was able to do a mixed methods approach where I did some psychological, psych perspective, being more like the traditional theoretical frameworks. But then I went ahead and added personal narratives and being able to really highlight people's experiences. So Eastern Washington University is a very conservative town. It is about 20 miles away from Spokane. Not sure if anybody knows where Spokane is in Washington State. But Seattle is about 5 hours away from Washington. So there's not very many, it's very conservative. So there's not a lot of out Latinx, Chicanx individuals there. But I was able to meet up with 3 women to share their experiences with me. So here I have them as participants. So participant number 1 was a senior, was age 25, and identified as undocuqueer. And they had they, them pronouns. I just don't have it on my PowerPoint. Participant number 2 was a senior, was 22, was Mexican Salvadorian. Participant number 3 was a freshman and had she, her, hers pronouns and was Chicana. Participant number 2 also had she, her pronouns. So what does it mean to be Chicanx or Latinx for these individuals? So what I did is I did a presentation, or excuse me, not a presentation, but an interview that lasted around 30 to 45 minutes, with each participant at a place of their choice on campus. It was a library for the most part, most accessible for students. So we went ahead and I asked them a series of questions about their identity, what it was like to be a student at Eastern Washington, what was it like to live within these kind of borderlands or dual identity perspectives. So this is what participant number 2 had to say. I definitely use Latina more because my mother is Salvadorian, and the way that I was taught was that Chicana is for Mexican American. I've noticed that over time it's changed and evolved, and it has encompassed over time to incorporate the Latino community. But I embraced it being identified as a Latina, as a Mexican Salvadorian American. So once again, what I did with my project is I use a grounded theory approach where I'm looking at the data or the analysis of my project and building what I have created and finding common themes across the board. Furthermore, I think what comes to mind when I go back and read this is my understanding of language and around discussions for we have these identities in place, right, to help us identify ourselves. But once again, these are different for everybody, and I think it goes back to challenging general discourses within European ways of thinking and being able to decolonize our minds in terms of identities. So here's my next participant, participant number 1. This is what they had to say about their Mexican American identity. So for me, it comes from a lot of pride. I used to identify as Mexican American. I'm undocumented, so a lot of that was also me trying to have ownership that I belong in this country. But you know, the more that you educate yourself on like the context of words and identity, the more I identify with Chicana or the phrase Chicano as a political statement, as a political ideology, as some that is striving for equality when you have success that you're bringing your family with you, rather than stepping forward without them. So for me, I identify as Chicana, and it means to me like more a political ideology and my way of being, you know, that's striving for something more, not just for me, but for everyone. So participant number 1 was really great to talk to them because they were doing a lot of political justice work on this conservative campus around being undocumented and being queer and finding that middle ground that seemed very impossible and that I know a lot of individuals, marginalized groups and individuals have to struggle with on a daily basis, being in, once again, the kind of political environment that we have going on. So here is one expert from participant number 3 within the systems of power within the family. I feel like I try too hard sometimes and it's not enough. I don't give up, but I try to live up to my mom's expectations, and it's never enough. My dad is just like always motivate me. I get my spontaneous and I can do anything I want from my dad. My mom's always like, be realistic. That kind of narrows my mind. I don't know, I feel like I narrow my expectations because of my mom. With my dad, I feel like I can do anything and be anything I want. My dad motivates me, always pushes me to things and gives me support. So I think it was interesting in terms of participant number 3 because their mother didn't really seem to be as supportive as their father. And I think it goes back to those cultural dynamics within being a Mexican American. So feeling like this machismo aspect is coming out, even though it was served a very positive experience for this participant. It was really interesting to hear them talk about how their mom just seemed to always shut them down versus having their mom be lifting them up. But I think that goes once again in terms of these patriarchal dynamics that we live in and that have been constructed within the culture. So here is a quote about inclusion. So I'm not sure how much time I have, but
You're good.
Okay, cool. So here is what they had to say. If I had to share something about the community, definitely, as you said, there are resources out there, and I didn't really come into contact with resources until I was in college. I grew up in LA, but I still hadn't came to terms with my sexuality until I was in high school. when I came to Washington. And through college, I saw that there was so much literature, film, and media, I could really see the examples. And although they are small in the queer Latina spectrum, they're still there. And just knowing that they're there, I didn't think there was stories similar to mine. So I think this is, once again, a lot of individuals that have to struggle with their identity in terms of coming to terms with what it means for them and living in a marginalized community or feeling like you can't be yourself within your family is, I think, huge for a lot of, or not a lot, but at least the participants that I spoke with in terms of their own identity. So for participant number 2, it was really important to find that community and that sense of belonging. So here are just some other interesting ones that I came across that they said that I thought was very powerful. You can cut me in half and expect me not to bleed because I'm going to feel both ways. So I think these were just really powerful. I find it easier to speak from my Latino voice than my queer voice. Once again, I think that's also very true. You have to navigate these identities within what it means to be queer and what it means to be Latina and what those identities mean and how they are constructed. So now that I'm a master's student, I'm thinking a lot about challenging the discourse and ways that we could create this new knowledge outside of, once again, these patriarchal ways of thinking or ways that we can collaborate them together. So I've been really getting into poetry lately, and I wrote this poem that I will share with you guys in terms of thinking about identities and coming to terms with it. So it is titled Tortuga. My heart falls on top of a tortuga, una tortuga que busca casa, a turtle that looks for home. My colonized mind has left me asking questions. When will we crawl out of it and live without intolerance? Individuality lets me speak for silence and mourn for an invisible existence. La tristeza de mi madre, my mother's sadness, as it's vocalized over thousands of miles, lost souls, stolen homes, claimed lives. Flutter as my ancestors turn in their graves, porque mi raza, cultura y la jotería nunca será igual. So that's all. I do have a poem I'd love to share from Borderlands, La Frontera, if I have time.
Sure.
Yes, okay, great. So this is titled To Live in the Borderlands Means You are neither hispana, india, negra, española, ni gabacha, it is mestiza, mulata, half-bred, caught in the crossfires between camps, while carrying all 5 races on your back, not knowing which side to turn to, run from. To live in the borderlands means knowing that the India in you betrayed for 500 years is no longer speaking to you. That Mexicans call you rajetas, that denying the Anglo inside you is as bad as having denied the Indian or black. Cuando vives en la frontera, people walk through you. The wind steals your voice. You're a burra, way, scapegoat. Forerunner of a new race, half and half, both woman and man, neither a new gender. To live in the borderlands means to put chile in the biscuit, eat whole wheat tortillas, speak Tex-Mex with a Brooklyn accent, be stopped by La Migra at the border checkpoints. Living in the borderlands means you fight hard to resist the gold exiler beckoning from the bottle, the pull of the gun barrel, the rope crushing the hollow of your throat. In the borderlands, you are the battleground. Your enemies are king to each other. You are home, a stranger. The border disputes have been settled. The void of shots have shattered the truce. You are wounded, lost in action, dead, fight back. To live in the borderlands means the mill with the razor white teeth wants to shut off. Your olive red skin, crush out of the kern, your heart. Pound your pinch, you roll you out, smelling like white bread but dead. To survive the borderlands, you must live sin fronteras, be a crossroads. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's give it up to Minerva Zayas. All right. Next, we're going to have Diana Vargas from San Diego State University. And the title of the talk is Queering Comunidad, Queering Survival, Latina Migrants' Experiences in Trans-Border Communities. It's a nice segue based on the poem. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me just read a quick bio about Diana as you're getting ready. Diana is a queer Latina currently working on her master's in women's studies at San Diego State University. Originally from Tijuana, she has lived in San Diego for many years. She has come to think of herself as a nepantlera, given her experiences living in between different cultures and identities. Her research interests include Latinx sexualities, migration, spiritual activism, and queer decolonial practices. In the near future, Diana hopes to begin a doctorate program in gender and women's studies or ethnic studies, and to continue a body, mind, spirit approach to scholarship and activism. When she's not working on her thesis, Diana likes to watch cat videos. Yes. She also enjoys reading and writing and is always looking for recommendations of queer women of color writers and binge-worthy TV shows. I'm sure here there's quite a few folks that'll come up to you afterwards. So welcome, Diana.
Thank you. Talk to me about the TV shows after, because as I'm writing the thesis, I need that procrastination. All right, so my name is Diana, and the title of my paper, my talk, is Queer en Comunidad, Queer in Survival, Latina Migrants' Experiences in Transporter Communities. And so this paper stems from my thesis research, which originally started as me wanting to sort of challenge the mainstream discourses of immigration given the current political system, and sort of challenging this idea that most of the time that position the US as the site of the American dream, the land of the free. Everybody wants to come here, especially queer migrants, because of the homophobia and sexism they encounter in their home countries. And after talking to queer Latina migrants, their stories challenge a lot of these narratives. And so from that and talking about it, I started thinking about more about spirituality. And so my thesis has sort of taken a different turn, where I'm proposing more of like a spiritual framework for exploring the lives of queer migrant women and queer women of color in particular. So that's sort of what I'm focusing on. But I did IRB, and I spoke with various people that did the interviews, so I didn't want to let that go to waste. So I'm talking about this here. Plus, I think it is very important. So I'm just going to read, and towards the end, I'm talking more about where my research is now. But I'm just going to go for it. So given the amount of discussions happening across many sociopolitical contexts, such as the various branches and systems of government, schools, and all types of media, it can be said that immigration has become one of the most important and controversial topics in the United States. Within some of these discussions, immigrants of color have been specifically targeted and portrayed as an undesirable group. Although the recent increase in immigration discourses brings attention to the racism and xenophobia sharing our current immigration policies, scholars suggest that immigration laws in the United States have historically functioned to purposefully exclude certain groups of people. As Ethne Lube Hyde writes in her introduction to Entry Denied, Controlling Sexuality at the Border, quote, immigration control is clearly one key dimension of the calculated management of life, because immigration is one of 4 ways that the United States has acquired new population. The other 3 ways have been slavery, annexation, which is colonization, and natural reproduction. Racial and ethnic barriers have always constrained who would be considered an actual or potential American, end quote. In addition to racial and ethnic barriers, the works of scholars such as Oliva Espín, Katie Acosta, and Lionel Cantú bring attention to how gendered and sexual identities similarly shape the legal boundaries of acceptable citizen subjects. While we must analyze how the immigration system operates, it is equally necessary to bring attention to how such laws and the ideologies they produce and reinforce shape the experiences of the people these construct as undesirable. As asserted by feminist scholars who employ an intersectional lens, it is important to address the intersections of race, gender, class, and sexuality, and how these facets of identity interact in order to create a unique experience of migration for some groups. While mainstream discourses tend to generalize specific populations as a whole, I want to focus on a group that is often rendered invisible within current discussions of immigration, and that is queer women of color. The experiences of migrant women are discussed in mainstream media, but such discussions do not address how women's varying sexual identities may shape their experiences of migration. And given that current immigration discourses mainly focuses on Latin American immigrants, I have similarly decided to center this group with the intent to provide a more intersectional analysis that is missing from these mainstream discourses. Queer Latina migrants inhabit many spaces, both tangible and ephemeral, the borderlands. As Gloria Saldúa writes, quote, it is a space where, quote, 2 or more cultures edge each other, where people of different races occupy the same territory, where under, lower, and middle and upper classes touch, where the space between 2 individuals shrinks with intimacy, end quote. All of these spaces, as well as the experiences that happen within them, become the place from which queer Latina migrants try to establish a sense of belonging in society. Producing scholarship that draws from the experiences of women in general, and queer migrant women in particular, is a timely response to the current social and political environment in which women, queer people, and migrants, along with many other groups, are being specifically targeted and attacked. Despite these hardships, members of these targeted groups continue to resist, exploring the reasons why those who inhabit these three particular identities come together can not only generate new insights into meanings of community, but can also shed light on strategies of resistance and survival. And so my research questions were, how do queer migrant women define community? How do experiences of migration influence the communities queer women of color form after crossing the border? How do the communities of queer migrant women in the US differ from their communities in their countries of origin? In what ways are they similar? And how does a queer sexual identity influence the communities that they seek? So to further challenge mainstream discussions of immigration, which often tend to prioritize the opinions of politicians and legal experts, I chose to follow a feminist approach of creating knowledge from the ground up, so talking to the women themselves, centering the voices and experiences of queer Latina migrants, and positioning those as a valid source of knowledge. So I conducted semi-structured interviews with 5 self-identified queer Latina migrants. And in my conversations with these women, it became apparent that their experiences of migration challenged both mainstream and academic immigration narratives. So contrary to the popular belief that most immigrants come to the United States and leave their home country behind seeking the American dream, these women found themselves in the US for different reasons, none of them stating the better life response we are accustomed to hearing. So although most women did mention access to education and career opportunities as reasons for migrating, the responses nonetheless steer away from a narrative that frames the potential benefits of migration solely in economic terms, as we're used to hearing. Furthermore, 3 of the women I spoke to had already returned to their country of origin after completing advanced graduate degree here in the US. Again, challenging the narrative which depicts migration as linear and always into the United States and permanent. And this has implications for immigration scholarship, as it suggests a need to move away from terminology that doesn't reflect the many possible iterations of the immigration experience. Following the works of scholars such as Patricia Sabella, I argue for the use of the term migrant as opposed to immigrant, as well as from immigration to migration, to, quote, evoke the ambiguities and indeterminacies that are involved in the process of migration, as well as the focus on those who are residing in the US, but who may also engage in transnational relations. So the use of this term also allows for the exploration of migration as a process, making room for approaches that explore migration in relation to changing ideologies and as an interaction between individuals and the state, as opposed to a linear geographical movement from one place to another. And another way in which my conversations with queer Latina migrants challenge migration is that while we discussed how Latin American countries continue to be places where state-sanctioned homophobia and sexism are prevalent, the women I interviewed do not think of the US as this safe haven. Again, challenging the discourse that positions the US as the pinnacle of freedom. So the lives of queer Latina migrants point to a need of moving away from analyses of migration that simplify and essentialize the experiences of queer migrants by reducing them to just their sexual identities. So beyond the need to expand how we understand and write about migration, the lives of queer Latina women specifically, can also provide us with new ways to think about community. In my conversations, I intentionally did not specify what I meant by community. I wanted to know how they understand it and experience it in their everyday lives. I also did not ask about community directly in relation to their identity. For example, I did not ask, are you part of any queer communities? Are you part of any migrant communities, Latinx, etc. I simply asked them to tell me which communities they are a part of. And I intentionally did this as to obviously not guide them in any direction and to see what emerged. And this resulted in my interviewees talking about community in terms of ideology instead of identity. And as well as As one of my interviewees described, she often struggles to feel part of the queer community in Peru, which is where she's from, because her politics are considered too radical. And this is her quote. And she says, "I feel that I will have to teach people a lot, people that I care about. Other people I don't, but to teach them how I think now and how I see things. And I don't know, make them see all these more structural things that I was mentioning you, make me more radical and whatever." So I think that there's a lot of teaching ahead of me. And I don't know if they want to hear it either or if they want to learn. So I'm kind of lost on what is going to happen, but I do value that community and being able to think, to talk, and being able to learn from other people. But I don't have it in all my communities in Lima for sure. So as her experience suggests, simply claiming a queer identity does not grant one access to a community. All interviewees echoed a similar understanding of community as a political space rooted in social justice and activism. And while some of them did say they belong to a queer community or a Latinx community, what brings them together is not just their sexual identity, but more importantly, their commitment to social justice. And that was something that they always highlighted and really focused on when talking about community. Even though I didn't guide them in that direction, that is where the conversation went. So moving away from an understanding of community obviously raises one important question. If queer Latina women are not forming communities based on the identities that they hold, their gender, sexual, or migrant identities, how are they finding this common ground given the many different political viewpoints and ideologies that they hold? So the following quotes can provide some sort of insights. So one of them, it's not up there, but I'm gonna read it. She says, quote, "There were also many other things that I didn't really feel I could identify with because for the first time ever, trying to figure out if I was part of that community or not, I was careful of not trying to co-opt an experience that really wasn't mine, you know? But then again, I did have a couple of experiences that were similar to those they had experienced." Wait, sorry, that's the wrong slide. These various, no, yeah, that's right. And this other participant, L, who's 26, said, "I would always look for people with like a leftist perspective always. Like I don't feel comfortable with people who are not part of that political spectrum. That's something I always look for in a community, yes." And S, who's 24, said, "In terms of how I define community, I think that community can be many things. On a structural level, I think there are different ways of looking at it, you know? It's definitely a group of people or a set of people interacting with institutions that shape a certain cultural margin, I would say. It's not a very static thing. It's always changing." So these various reflections conceptualize community in terms of shared experiences, feelings of belonging, and ideologies. Together, they suggest an understanding of community as imaginary rather than a concrete place or space. And in his groundbreaking work, Imagine Communities, Benedict Anderson discusses the role of language in creation of a national consciousness. And while Anderson's analysis is specific to the rise of nationalism, his notion that language creation, what he refers to as spoken acts, are crucial to community formation can also inform our understanding of how queer Latina migrants form and sustain communities. So for the woman I interviewed, stating one's political ideologies and social justice views becomes the spoken act that calls forth like-minded people. So those who identify with their views, regardless of their identities, are considered part of their imagined community. A community not tied to geographical space. Further, communities are also formed based on shared experience, although not necessarily experiences related to their gender, sexual, and migrant identities. Yeah, this is where they start talking. Sorry, I forgot about these quotes. So making connections through experience. So this is what I was talking about. One of them said there were also many other things that I didn't really feel I could identify with because for the first time ever, I was careful. Oh no, I do have that one. Sorry, I mixed up. I think creating community, it's more of a feeling than a collective or physical space. That's the one that I was talking about. So at the same time that the concept of imagined communities is useful in this analysis of how queer Latina migrants think about community, this framework also stems, as I said, from an analysis of nationalism. So it's from an analysis rooted in an understanding of a Western nation state. And it is the same Western nation state that positions queer Latina migrants as undesirable subjects. So while this framework may be suitable for this analysis, it is not expansive or fully reflective of the experiences of the women I interviewed. And following the sentiments expressed by my interviewees that ideologies are important to how they think about their lives and experiences as women, as migrants, and as queer individuals, I point to the need of creating new theoretical frameworks that acknowledge the various contradictions and ambiguities in queer women's lives. And this is sort of more when I'm talking more about my current research now. So in her landmark work, so theorizing the feeling now. In her landmark work of exploring spiritual and aesthetic alterities in the works of Chicana artists at the end of the 20th century, Laura Perez contemplates people's relationship to their land. She asks, quote, "What could seem more solid than the earth and the land we live on? And yet our relationship to these does not give us a sense of being arraigados, rooted, that is, of belonging, being at home. The ideas of knowing your place and having a place are tied together and suggest that the personal sense of being at home, whether in society or in your body, is shaped by our sense of belonging socially. This sense of belonging is not untied from our historical relationship to the places in which we dwell." So although Paris's reflections are found in a text that discusses Chicana art, her question nonetheless captures this elusive feeling, the ephemeral place of the community that has also been kind of widely theorized about in feminist and queer scholarship through the narrative of longing for a home. And is also echoed in my conversations with queer Latina migrants. So scholars have been grappling with this personal sense of being at home and its relation to the personal and political implications of occupying marginal identities. So as alluded to, Perez's exploration of the spiritual and various types of Chicana art, those who are marginalized attempt to articulate their relationship to a society that erases them from historical and sociopolitical narratives through the creation of new theoretically oppositional ways of thinking. And I think that the fact that a lot of the women I interviewed were not fully able to articulate how they think about community suggests that there is no set framework or not a framework rooted in their experience from which they can draw from. So by showing the ways, so I suggest the possibility of the spiritual as a foundation for this new oppositional framework. As Perez discusses in her book, which is called Chicana Art, The Politics of Spiritual and Aesthetic Alterities, the spiritual implications of the works of women of color are oftentimes ignored. And we can see this also with the works of Gloria Anzaldúa, Cherry Moraga, Audre Lorde as well. They talk about spirit, they talk about the erotic. Anzaldúa draws from indigenous knowledge, and although she's talking about these things, when we talk about their works, it seems like we just gloss over the spiritual aspect. So I want to sort of center that and sort of investigate what potential lies there. So the artists whose work Paris analyzes in her book grapple with these places in which they dwell, and they attempt to materialize the many contradictory identities, histories, languages, and cultures they embody in these spaces. So Perez identifies the spiritual frameworks through which the artists attempt to create meaning. So by showing the ways in which Chicana artists redefine spirituality outside of our Western understanding as spirituality related to institutionalized religion, for example, she materializes that which is usually invisible though generally acknowledged as real, which are emotions and lived experiences, this feeling of being in community. So Perez alludes to the possibility of destabilizing hegemonic knowledges that prioritize Western ways of thinking and which limit our understanding of ourselves and our relation to each other. The many iterations of the spiritual in the works of Perez analyzes are an example of acknowledging the ways in which our histories of colonization shape understandings of ourselves and our relation to the world around us. So following this way of thinking, decolonizing our histories and identities within the many spaces we occupy, such as our communities, becomes a valid method of reclaiming ourselves. In her book, Perez uses the spiritual as a decolonial framework to make connections between these ephemeral concepts and the material world. So by making possible theoretical space where art, by making possible this theoretical space, as opposed to the usual Western academic approach, is what I propose as the guide for the framing of the spiritual as a new starting point for the colonial framework. So basically what Perez is doing, she's flipping the script. So I'm similarly identifying how women express their emotions and experiences in relation to their histories and their communities, their imagined communities. So the women whose experiences I write about inhabit different, often conflicting cultures, ideas, and places. And through remembering of their histories and experiences, through talking about how they experience themselves as queer Latina migrants, much like Chicana artists, they are employing the spiritual to make sense of the ephemeral, these feelings and longings for home, the everyday experiences of being placed in the margins and of being erased. So in looking to the lives of these women, including my own, my intention is to write from within but against the grain, as it's like a term from decolonial, like post-colonial, decolonial theories. So drawing from the theoretical space of the margin, that is, the works of queer women of color. Our ways of understanding the lives of queer Latina migrants and of women of color in general require a decolonial spiritual turn, a moving towards a theoretical and activist practice that not only attempts to expand meaning of what the spiritual means, but also embodies this practice by exploring its integral aspect in the lives of queer Latina migrants.
Thank you, Diana. Our third presenter will be Anthony Williams from here at UCLA. And the title of the talk is It Means Loving Yourself Enough. Black Women Leaders in Self-Care in the Black Lives Matter Movement. Anthony is a proud Black, queer, non-binary first-year student in the Department of Sociology. He received his bachelor's degree in sociology in 2016 from UC Berkeley, where he was a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow. He began organizing with the African Black Coalition when the movement for Black Lives began that reflect his scholarship. He's interested in race, ethnicity, sexuality, and gender, focusing on the ways that racial and class-based inequalities disproportionately affect Black, brown, and/or queer youth within social movements and the carceral state. He also regularly blogs and writes for non-academic publications such as Hazlit, Electric Lit, and EFNIKS. Please join me in welcoming Anthony.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, because it's a Friday, and I know you don't have to be. So I appreciate that. I also want to thank the organizers for putting on this conference. To have it be going on for 20 years is really beautiful. And then thank you, Raja, for being here as a moderator. So just so you have an idea, this is how the talk's going to go. We're going to start with introduction, which I'll do in a second. Raja did most of it. My abstract, my background, my research questions and respondents, and then self-care as addressing trauma, which is my main research finding, right? So that's actually the theoretical contribution. So for the introduction, I just wanted to mention that while doing this research, I identified as a cisgender queer man. And now I identify as non-binary. So that's important in thinking about the limitations of the research, and that I was dealing with Black women as a Black man, right? And so there are certain things when I'm asking them about self-care that they're not going to tell me. And that's a limitation in the research that I do want to acknowledge. And also the idea that our gender is very fluid. So the folks who I spoke to, some of their identities may have even changed since I spoke to them. So I'm going to start with my abstract, just so you have an idea of what generally I'm talking about. So social movement, hold on one second. There we go. Cool. Social movement scholarship is accounted for leadership capital, or the combination of qualities that contribute to creating an effective leader, in order to explain the inner workings of social movement success. However, the scholarship neglects the effects of everyday oppression on the leaders of social movements. This qualitative study, my study, highlights respondents who face multiple forms of oppression, such as race, class, gender, and sexuality. So this is the work that I did as an undergraduate at UC Berkeley. It went through IRB, just like my colleagues. It has not been published yet. If you're interested in learning more about it too, we can talk after, because this is just a brief overview. So entering the conversation, I just want you to be aware that there is there's literature on social movements, right? So there's Malucci, there's Klandermans, and that mostly focuses on what is a social movement, how do we define it, what are the frameworks, right? Then we have interventions from McAdams, Payne, Barnett, Robnett. Those interventions talk about Black women, for example, what it means to be a woman, right? But they generally don't talk about sexuality, so they don't talk about queerness, they don't talk about intersectionality, and it's a big issue, right? Then we have leadership, Gusfield, Morris, DeSacer, I believe. And those folks talk about what it means to be a leader within a social movement. Then we have which y'all are probably familiar with, charismatic leadership. We have a bunch of authors for that, as well as like Weber, the idea of an MLKJ, right? Or on the opposite side of the spectrum, and the more evil side, the definitely evil side, Hitler, right? There's a reason that Hitler was able to get all of those people. It was because he was charismatic, right? Just like MLKJ was, although their aims are completely different. And I would never, except for in this context, put them in the same sentence. So don't misquote me. Then we have leadership capital, strategies, and teams. And so that's like what I'm focusing on, right? Leadership capital is what makes you a leader, what makes you, and how do we define that through scholarship, right? Then we have strategies and teams. How are you broken down into that? And then this project originally started looking a lot at microaggressions. Because I wanted to look at the structural issues through how they're enacted daily, right? So if the structural issue is queer antagonism, right, and misogynoir, then how is that enacted on a daily basis? I ended up moving away from that framework, but I did still talk about microaggression theory. So my research questions were twofold. What is self-care, and what self-care strategies do Black Lives Matter leaders create and utilize? And then how do self-care strategies influence tactical strategies of Black Lives Matter chapter leaders? So to give you some background too, my methods were qualitative interviews. They were semi-structured. They're semi-structured qualitative interviews. They lasted anywhere from 45 minutes to about an hour and 45 minutes. I had 4 respondents, and what I did was grounded theory like some of my colleagues. So I was looking at using a Black feminist framework, specifically Patricia Hill Collins. How do we examine this, right? So the goal was to have a theoretical contribution of what is self-care. Like, a lot of us may know what it is in the room, but academia doesn't care, right? So it's only in popular publications, but not in academic publications. Outside of the fact that there's a public health self-care, which means how someone's dealing with it. They're dealing with HIV, for example, or they're dealing with aging, right? Like, what does that care look like? And then the other one was the empirical contribution of what, not what is self-care, but what are they doing for self-care? What are the practices? So here are my respondents. I don't know how much you can read, but their names are pseudonyms that they either gave to me or that I assigned to them. So we have Simone, Blue, Alex, and Ashanti. And then I have their roles, their gender, their age, their race, their sexuality, their marital status, class, educational attainment, occupation, income bracket, and a few notes. So can everyone read it? Cool, yeah? Okay, so I'm gonna highlight just a few things because you can read it. The youngest participant was 23 at the time. The oldest was 52. This data was collected in between February 2016 and I finished in, I guess, March with the interviews, February to March 2016. They're all conducted on the phone or through Skype because they were at different chapters within. So at the time, there were about 30 BLM chapters. And I went and I talked to, I got access through email and then reached out to all of them and I was like, would you like to do this, right? If you identify as a Black woman, over 18, straight or not straight, and that was it. And so each of them, they were co-founders of their own individual chapter rather than co-founders of the movement, right? So 23 to 52, they were all cis women. They all identify as Black, although it's noted in the notes here that Simone is light-skinned and biracial, and that does matter in terms of how she's received in the world. Then we had queer, questioning hetero and hetero. And then Simone has, as she identifies as queer, sometimes bisexual. She's married to a cishet man, though, so that's not always something that is read because she appears femme and has a husband. Then everyone was either lower middle or working to lower middle class and working to mid. And then most of them had some college and no one made over $50,000. So that's just an idea of who we're dealing with. I'm in sociology. I'm a first year in the doctoral program, and the question they always ask, and when I was doing this research, is so what, right? Like, why does this matter? And a lot of you, because the nature of you being in this room, I think you could figure out why it matters, right? But you have to justify to the academy, to the white supremacist academy, to the white supremacist patriarchal academy, why does this matter? And so using Hill Collins, these are two quotes that this is why it matters. I'm building on the scholarship that she's had. Struggles for group survival are just as important as confrontations with institutional power, right? So when we're thinking about self-care, it's a struggle for individual and group survival. So that's one reason it matters. Another one, this is a longer quote, but I cut it down. Racism, sexism, and poverty have been so severe that African American women have found it difficult to participate in organized political activities. Instead, strategies of everyday resistance have largely consisted of trying to create spheres of influence, authority, and power, and she continues to say in areas where they typically have not been able to be, right? So when we're thinking about it, if all of these things block you out because you're black, you're a woman, and in this case, some of them are queer, then you're gonna try to create power in another way, right? So before we get into the findings, we're almost there, y'all. I want to give more background. You should know about BLM by now. If you don't, I don't know what to tell you. But these are the stakes of the movement, right? This is a quote from Ashanti, one of my respondents. She says, "We've seen each other cry, like we've seen each other down. We've seen each other maced and in the streets. We know when we protest. We know when we go to conferences. We know every single time, and we talk about this, that like it could be our lives." Every single time. And forgive me, I forgot the period in the quotation to close it. But the idea is that it's not just social media and it's not just an action, right? Like we see what's happening, right? The names that are on my shirt, the reason I wore a shirt is because these are black women who've been killed by the police, right? And so it's not just, when you think about Sandra Bland or any of these women, anyone of them on my shirt, it's not just like, oh, I'm gonna go out and protest today. Like, no, your life is on the line at every time. So this is the stakes of the movement and why self-care also really matters. So these are actually my findings, right? I came up with a working definition of self-care based on these 4 interviews. So we have self-care as the act of prioritizing, oh, I forgot of, sorry, y'all. Self-care is the act of prioritizing one's own physical, spiritual, and emotional needs as a way to heal from trauma. The 2 iterations include self-care band-aids and self-care practices. So self-care band-aids are short-term solutions that lead to instant gratification by alleviating temporary pain from recent trauma, right? So that could be a drink. So if you're having a really rough day, you had a really rough day and you go out and you have, say, 3 alcoholic beverages. That's a self-care band-aid. Now, whether we want to classify that as a self-destructive self-care band-aid or not, that's a whole different thing, right? But it's a self-care band-aid because you just want to feel better in the moment. It's not necessarily a practice because it's not sustainable, right? Then we have self-care practices, which are long-term, sustainable solutions meant to ground a person in their reality, heal from recent trauma, heal from past trauma, and to pad the blow from potential future trauma, right? So how do you ground yourself? So that's the main finding. I'm going to talk about what that means. So this is the quote that my thesis is named after. This is Alex. She's the elder. She was 52 when I interviewed her, and she was brilliant. She said, first and foremost, it means loving yourself. And this is when I asked them, much like my colleagues, in research, you don't want to say, so what is self-care to you? You know, you want to ask around the question to figure out what that means, and you want to get them to elicit the answer without guiding them, right? So I was asking them, what do you mean, like when you say that you take care of yourself? What does this look like, right? And I had a whole interview schedule. First and foremost, it means loving yourself. It means loving yourself enough to listen to and address my needs, all of them, whether they're physical or spiritual or emotional. It's about being accountable to myself first and foremost. So it was like that. I was like, well, I don't need to interview anybody else, but I did because I needed to confirm that was a common finding, right? So self-care, the way it actually, this is how I coded what they gave me. I was like, so what do you do? Like concretely, what does that mean? Break it down for me, walk me through it, right? And so I coded it into self-reflection and mindfulness, creation, distraction and avoidance, release, spirituality, or witnessing beauty. And of course, there's overlap in between these categories, but these are the broader categories. So self-reflection and mindfulness could be walking, exploring one's own body, writing personally for oneself. Creation can be art, music, DJing, playlists, photography. One specific example, these are all specific, but very specific, is Simone would mix turmeric and water and I believe lime juice and into a little potion. And she would do that every morning and drink that, right? So it was an act of being like, I'm gonna love myself every morning, right? or coloring in a coloring book. That's what Alex did. Then we have distraction and avoidance, which is what we were talking about, Netflix, right? Which is what we do as grad students. Then you have release, right, which can be dancing, that can be sex, that can be other things. You have spirituality, which is pretty self-explanatory. A lot of these women practice Ifa or another type of African spirituality. And then witnessing beauty, the example that someone gave was Tumblr. So going through and looking at pictures of flowers or beautiful black women or something, because it's hard to look at the trauma of blackness and us being killed every day. And sexually assaulted in the case of women, although it happens to men and non-binary people as well, but in higher rates to women. Then there's the barriers to self-care, right? So there's external stressors. So the goal in identifying these were that one of the respondents told me it's about letting down the movement, letting down black people. And so the barriers to actually doing what you need to do were guilt, and that was the biggest one, right? The other one was well-being overall. The third one was time, and the fourth was social networks. And I want to focus on the guilt. We all know it's hard to like treat yourself, right? Or to do what you need to do. The last two are really important because time, if you are, often these women were organizers, some of them were mothers, some of them have partners, they usually have more than one job. So how do you actually have the time to do what you need to do? And how do you dedicate that time? And then the last one is social networks. If you actually have a social network where you can do this work, right, where I'm being supported, like I have three friends actually in the audience, that's beautiful, right? If I didn't, this work might feel a little different, right? Like, so thinking about that, and I saw someone's mother, or was it, yeah, that's beautiful, right? Like to see you in the audience, that matters, and that's like actually in terms of like research is important too. But then there are also internal stressors. There's gendered interpersonal organizing. These are black women in a movement that's been uplifting black men, and then black men are basically shitting on them, right? So like, what does that mean? So there's gendered interpersonal organizing. There's conflicts within, right? So there's like drama. It's like, I slept with this person. It gets really bad. And if you're an organizer yourself, you know whatever movement you're in, it's bad. And then there's pacing. So this was something that Alex talked about. Alex was 52, right? And Alex talked about young folks want to get it now, do it now. And I saw Elaine Brown speak, former chairwoman of the Black Panther Party, and she was saying in the 70s and the 60s, they thought they could do it. They thought like the people before couldn't do it, but we can do it, right? And it was because they're in their 20s, and they didn't realize that Black people have been trying to do this since we got in this country, right? And so it's not going to be as quick. We will not see liberation within our lifetimes, but we're going to work toward that, right? So pacing can be hard because it's like you got to do this and do that. And if you're doing that, then how do you actually take care of yourself? Then there's self-sacrifice. There's the idea that black women need to be the sacrificial lamb, and then they do that to each other too, and other people hold them to that, and that's not healthy. Then there's accountability. Accountability within, like how are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? What does that look like? And the biggest one too was lack of resources. If you don't have money, then you have to work multiple jobs to be able to do this work. If you don't have a house, which literally happens to some of these women, they are houseless at times. What do you do? How are you supposed to be an organizer fighting for black liberation when you don't have somewhere to sleep your head or rest your head? And then I'm almost at the end. I want to talk about Ashanti's quote on the impact of self-care, because this really highlights it. And so I'm going to read the full quote. Y'all are seeing just a section of it. She said, I mean, if we're all burnt out, if none of us are taking care of ourselves, if none of us are holding each other accountable to taking care of ourselves, then we can't do the work that we need to do. So it's crucial that we learn and we know when each other aren't okay. Because this work really does drain so much of who you are, well, not. It uplifts who you are, it affirms who you are in so many ways, but at the same time, it's very draining. And so self-care is kind of like in a movement that kind of like pulls and pulls and pulls and pulls and pulls at your heartstrings and at your emotional stockpile. Self-care is something that kind of fills it back up. And so without, you're drained and drained and drained, and your heartstrings are pulled and pulled and pulled until they like eventually just break. And there's nothing keeping them together. So without self-care, there's a whole lot of taking from, but not a lot of building back up. And so I think that we just have to be very intentional about making sure that we are filling our tanks back up after the things that we do for other people and for the movement. And so without it, I don't think we can be really effective at all. So that actually is segues us into collective care. So I talked a lot about self-care, right? But self-care is not necessarily what works for everyone. I'm an introvert, so I need a lot of self-care, but I also need collective care, right? Collective care is the act of prioritizing one's own physical, spiritual, and emotional needs as a way to heal from trauma, done with others, right? So self-care collective care is self-care done with other people rather than oneself. Examples include speaking truth, so getting up here and talking about whatever it is, right? Sharing stories, so saying this happened to me. The hashtag #MeToo could be an example, right? Although that can also be triggering and traumatizing in other ways. Venting, whether that's just with one other person or multiple people. Writing for a public audience rather than writing for oneself, right? The difference between journaling and writing publicly. And then being with Black women. And so the biggest thing people were talking about was like, Black women, like that's my self-care, you know? And so they often talked about this as self-care, but I, as a researcher, said this is collective care, right? Self-care is on your own, collective care is with someone else. But being with Black women is what refills them, often because people like myself, non-binary folks, men, are not, we drain a lot, right? And so then sometimes you need to be around other Black women who get it, right? And so this actually explains a little bit. This is Blue. She says, and that in terms of self-care, honestly being around other Black women is some of the best self-care because we love each other so hard. I had another quote that I didn't put in, but Alex said that basically a friend of hers says that she's like, if you look up the dictionary for queer, she should be in it. She's straight. She actually said a comment that was a little, I was like, ooh. But she's straight, she was married, she's a mother. But because of her love for Black women, it is so queer, right? And in terms of she doesn't want to sleep with them, she's not sexually attracted to them, but she loves Black women in a way that she will never love a Black man, right? And so she was saying, but she was like, I don't claim that, right? I identify as heterosexual because I don't want to take up that space. But I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about collective care. So this is an image of Nina Simone from her documentary on Netflix. It says, I thought we should get our rights by any means necessary. And so I just want to talk about the broader implications. The idea, so I did 4 Black women organizers. I basically did like life and oral histories. The reason I included their class was because I was like looking at how did they even get here, right? Like how did you get to be an organizer given all the barriers that are in your way, right? And most of these women had started organizing around age 12. You know what I mean? They organized within their own lives for housing rights or environmental rights or something else. And then I also wanted to make sure we recognize that what seems obvious, right? I remember reading research studies when I was younger and thinking that, like, this is obvious, especially when it comes to Black people. It's like, we know that cops are pulling this over a higher rate. Like, but sometimes you need that data to make sure that it's actually, right? If you can't show data, then some people are like, no, you're lying, so you need data, right? So the implications of having a theory of self-care and actual practices of self-care is really important. There's also broader implications for the movement, but I wasn't focusing so much on that. I wanted to focus on, in this presentation, I wanted to focus on what does self-care look like, why do we need to think about it, and why is it not as big, why was it not as big in other movements, right? How they learned in this movement from other movements. So that is where I will end. This is my email. And a headshot taken by the lovely Ji Jing. She's an awesome photographer. You can look her up. You gotta plug your friends. Word. If you have any questions, you can email me at antwilliams@g.ucla.edu. Thanks again.
Thank you, Anthony. And let's give all 3 of these amazing scholars. My heart is feeling really full right now, so thank you for sharing this incredible work, and it's clear that this is not just scholarship, this is new work, and that there's so much, as is pretty for me as a queer brown scholar, we don't just do the work, we are the work, and that you are embodying that. So thank you all, just honor that. I think we've heard, we're talking about healing. We're talking about healing in multiple levels. We're talking about collective healing, individual healing, what it means to be seen, what it means to be heard, what it means to exist and simply be in this universe, and what it means to be authentically, what it means to be complexly, what it means to be ourselves and particularly the folks that we care about, whether or not we are acknowledged, and how and when and where we challenge and engage in that. And so I have a lot of questions. just based on all this stuff. But I have a couple of questions for each of you, and then I'd love to maybe open it up so we can actually have a dialogue as well. Let me start with Minerva. So I really appreciate kind of the way you framed the border. One of my favorite texts, right? Really think about navigating the and, both and in between, and being neither, and kind of the struggle of finding what that is, right? And I love the way Anzaldúa frames the fact that it is a boredom, but it's an ever-changing boredom. So we don't really know where the hell we are, and that's part of what makes us who we are. So it's both part of our resilience and part of our oppression. And you talked about that really around these Latina women, particularly in Eastern Washington, which is a very interesting physical space, right?
Definitely.
So tell me a little bit more about just the way you were having the quote. The quote's really beautiful, and your poetry was also just incredible. Tell me about what does this scholarship mean to you, and what does healing mean to you?
So that's a really good question because
There we go.
I think that's a really good question because I think me and my peers at Oregon State always talk about this, and we're always like, when are we going to stop feeling tired, or stop, like, when are we going to feel like this is like paying off, or that we don't have to explain ourselves to people that don't get it? So I feel like it's really based around my own personal experiences as identifying as somebody that's lesbian, but also challenging what that means, like challenging that, my sexual orientation might change, or my gender identity could change, and that's all perpetuated through this white lens, through heteronormativity, and it's all something that we've all been perpetuated by. So I think it's really about bringing it back to the personal experience and really being able to highlight what that means for these people and ourselves. And I think for me, I think Anthony's presentation really made me think about self-care and what we can do. And I think for me, it's a lot of things like collective care, hanging out with other people and trying not to talk about politics or school, or, like writing poetry. Or it seems like that seems to be like lately the best way that I project my thoughts and feelings is through poetry. So it's also very re-energizing and healing, but it also feels really good to be able to conceptualize words, thoughts, and ideas through these creative ways of writing. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And the other piece, there's a piece that's really stood out to me when you said the Latin voice versus the queer voice, and kind of the negotiation of that, right? And so we're here at a queer studies conference, and so
Right.
and I think it's really powerful that we're talking about the intersections very deep ways.
Right.
So tell me more about kind of what else have you found kind of within your scholarship and thinking about what the struggle and the tension between that queer voice and Latina voice, and is that tension where does it come from? What does that look like, and how do you negotiate that as someone that identifies as that?
Right. So I think for me, while I was doing this project and doing these interviews with these women, was understanding my positionality as a queer woman, as somebody that, I have this identity and I understand these things. And one of my participants actually asked me, so did you ask yourself these questions? And I was like, at the moment, I was like, whoa, like I should probably have thought about that. But, I took the time to actually really think about it and, write about it and journal about it. And I was like, wow, like this is, when you sit down and think about it, it's a lot harder than we think.
Yeah.
So I think it really is in terms of the kind of multiple systems of oppression that we are working through. And it almost seems like being a person of color is one oppression, and then and the oppression in the general world, and then below that seems to be your sexual orientation, that for Chicana individuals, or at least Mexican American women, like the ones that I spoke to, or in my case, being a Chicana woman myself, it's something that you don't talk about in the family. It's something that you don't bring up, or if you tell, or, for example, my mom has told me, and this is something that some of my participants brought up, like you don't tell your extended family this.
Sure.
Unless you happen to bring a partner over around at some point. So I think it's kind of like picking and choosing your battles, and I think a lot of us in the room could kind of contest to that and know what that kind of means. And I think in terms of my further scholarship, I'm really excited to continue to working on this project and expanding on really just decolonizing my mind and the work that I'm doing and challenging what does it mean to be queer. You know, these identities have lasted for so long, for example, in Indigenous Two-Spirit individuals, and they never really had a name to them. Like, it was always like if they liked men, they liked men. If they liked women, they liked women, and it was never a problem. So I think this is because it's something that I'm really learning about right now, in terms of decolonization and Indigenous people and how we are on their land, and we've been all colonized through all this. So a lot of thinking, and not sure where it's going to go, but I'm really excited to see what will be the end result with a master's thesis. So
That's awesome. Thank you. I was excited to see a lot of Black and brown queer folks cited kind of in your research. I think often it's so easy for us to go to the, as a friend of mine says, dead French men, to cite people as kind of the way we think about legitimate scholarship.
Right.
And I think you all even talked about how do we really center all three of you really talked about centering the narratives from the bottom up and shifting the power structure of what is legitimate, what is academic, and what we think about. So thank you for that. I want to go over to Diana. Diana, I really appreciated your work in thinking about kind of the place and space. A lot of my research is on international students and sense of belonging on campuses and contexts. And so it's really interesting to kind of hear the way you talked about kind of challenging narratives of belonging and what that meant, and really interesting around the finding or not finding community based on identity and then politics and these different aspects of ourselves that we often assume we're going to find community. And what I think you said something beautiful around simply claiming a queer identity doesn't grant access to our queer community, right? And so talk about kind of your research methodology and what do you think that helped kind of those stories come out for you?
Sorry, just to clarify, do you mean like how did that come to that, exploring that aspect?
Yeah, how were you able to elicit that level of trust and how were you able to engage with them in that way to get those stories?
Yeah, actually that's something that sort of, when I was presenting, I talked about a shift in my research that I initially started about thinking about community, and now I'm trying to write the theory, I guess. And how that happened is because I honestly did not expect to get those stories from interviews. I did most of my interviews were over Skype. Like I said, 3 of the women I interviewed were no longer in the U.S., and I had never met them before. And yet, it was so strange how over Skype, every time they said something, I was like, yes, I feel you. Like, feeling such a connection with someone that you don't know. And I know that it's not just because they also identify as queer or they also had experience of migration. And it just made me think a lot about that, like the feelings that it invoked in me to go through that process. Like, I feel that, and this is when I'm talking about the spiritual framework, I feel that within academia, we're so focused on this, we have to remove ourselves from our research and our writing. But I think that that is what takes away from exploring those things that I think it's important to place ourselves there and to sort of explore those things that are kind of weird to think about, and maybe we don't have the words for it yet. So I decided to just go for it, I guess. And part of it is also because of how my experience as a graduate student has been. I don't know how much I can say, but the thing is,
I will not report to your advisor. I don't know who they are.
No, my advisor is amazing, but it's just the thing of, as I said, being a queer woman of color in a women's studies department that prides itself in being the first women's studies department in the nation, but is now really struggling with this like women's studies, gender studies, like how do we, like a lot of us graduate students coming in identify as queer or non-binary, and a lot of our professors are the ones who who identify as lesbians or as queer also, but who really have that apprehension still
Sure.
for the word queer and for the fear that if we talk about queerness, if we talk about gender, then we're decentering cis women. If we and I think that I honestly felt, and I wasn't the only one, but I honestly felt like I wasn't heard. Whenever I brought up queer theory, you know, it's like cis white man, you know, the gay white man, like the evil figure of the evil white man. That it's like sort of the lesbian
Sure.
kind of rebuttal to wanting to talk about queer theory. So I kind of experienced that a lot, and also with spirituality, you know, grad school is hard work, so as you know, Anthony was talking about, like self-care is really important, and I never really thought about. I mean, I thought about self-care, but being in grad school, it really made me think about how like I need something more than Band-Aids, because I used a lot of Band-Aids in grad school. I mean, in undergrad and sometimes still in grad school, but
Yeah.
you know, Netflix. But I needed something that was more, as Anthony was saying, just long term, something sustainable.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, well, what can I sustain more than my work? Like if this
Sure.
is the career that I want, so this is the space I want to be with, and it's not for me. It's not about necessarily being in academia, but it's just it's about that feeling.
Sure.
Like even now here, like I can spill the beans on my department and feel at ease doing so. So that's sort of my reasons for talking about this and exploring the spiritual, which again is something that I feel is silenced a lot.
Awesome.
Because wanting to bring up, you know, the spiritual aspects of like Ansaldúa, she talks about it a lot. Lord through like the erotic. Also, I think that is the spirit. So, you know, again, bringing that up, it's, yeah, but religion is like this patriarch. I'm like, yeah, but that's not what I'm talking about. Like, we need to move away from these Western frameworks. And there are so many women of color who have been trying to do this. And I just really, really think it's so important to really give queer women of color specifically a space in academia, not just like being there as a token, it's not just being in taking up space,
Sure.
but really producing knowledge.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Yes. You know, I tell one of the things that so I run the LGBT Center here on campus, and one of the things that I tell folks every day that when I walk in is an act of revolution, because I myself, given my complexities of identity, I'm not supposed to exist in this
Right.
context, right? And so for me, it is for us to exist is an act of revolution.
Yeah.
So I think so. Thank you for that. That really resonated to me. Anthony, thank you as well. Really some insightful stuff. I love the way you broke down self-care and the concept of the Band-Aids and the practices and the, you know, you talked about the sustainable practices. That really rang for me, because I was like, oh shit. Like, I was like, maybe I shouldn't have that drink tonight. You know, and so it helped me really kind of contextualize how we as activists also often, you know, both in trying to do collective care, but also take care of the community, often don't take care of ourselves, find easy ways to kind of take care enough to get to other work, and particularly around Black women, and the burden that I would say they hold in our collective of healing and work, and particularly within the Black Lives Matter movement. There's a lot of stuff that's happening. I think they really have been, and especially Black queer women have, I would say, the leaders of most of our social justice movements in the world. They just often get forgotten or erased intentionally. So what did you learn from these interviews that you did not expect to learn when you started?
So for me, thank you for that question. And thanks, y'all. Y'all are an awesome audience. Y'all have been very supportive to all of us. So I want to, which is typically at the deal at conferences. So I wanted to say what surprised me was recognize, well, one, I don't self-care very well. So like that was something people were like, well, you study it. And I was like, but I don't do it. And I think what the big thing for me was learning that no one teaches you how to do it, right? And so I didn't mention this in the presentation, and I should have, but what they talked about was returning to what they formerly did, right? So for Alex, that was coloring. When she was a young girl, she loved coloring and singing. And so that's what she had to return to. And that's what that became her self-care practice that was sustainable over long term, right? So the idea is not to demonize Band-Aids, because as queer people of color, we got to do what we got to do to survive another day, literally, you know. However, we do need to think about how do we continue this work. And it really made me think about like elders too, right? Because Alex became a lot of the basis of my thesis. I had a 23-year-old and a 24-year-old with varying levels of education, right? And then I had another, and they're all brilliant. And then I had another one who's in her 30s, and then I had this 54-year-old woman who went through doing anti-rape work, right? And went through all these movements and is a survivor herself and works with formerly incarcerated men, right? And it made me think about the queer elders we don't often reach out to, and then who we sometimes do reach out to, but then we have issues with because they're focusing on lesbian, and if you say queer, then that's an affront, right? If someone uses they them pronouns, it happened when I was seeing Sherry Maraga and at Berkeley. She like said she didn't get it, and it was really hurtful that people ended up walking out because she was saying that they them pronouns don't make sense, right? And so if someone identifies as non-binary, I use he and they, like what are you saying, right? As a scholar, as a queer elder that we respect. So that was the most surprising thing for me, is figuring out no one teaches us. We have to teach ourselves. And then once we realize it, it's our job to like pull back and pull forward with people wherever you are, whether you're a scholar or an activist or organizer. And then there's also a generalizability. I did this with Black women for a particular reason, but I realized like how applicable this is. You know what I mean? Like I saw nodding heads. I saw people thinking about like what they do and don't do. And it doesn't really matter if you're a Black woman or not. And not to all lives matter, because no, but everything, the idea of doing theory is that it should be applicable more than just Mike. It should be applicable to more than just them. But I'm done. Yeah. so yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. So one of the things that I've been thinking about, just kind of some of the themes that I have seen, is around, again, healing is such an important word for a lot of Black and brown folks and queer folks, and I would argue that the most spiritual people that I know are often brown, Black, and queer folks of color, and often and yet we're often not part of the conversations, right? Something that I just wanted to offer as some food for thought for all three of you as you think about your work is thinking about, I just read this really amazing article by Bowleg, 2008. It's out of Maryland, about thinking about identities not as commas identity. So it's not just Black, comma, queer, comma, cis or trans or whatever, but really that those iterations of kind of isolated identities do not become the same when you add them together. The summation of our identities are not the same. In fact, they're more complex, they're more real, and you categorizing them is such a Western colonial way of structuring the way who we are as this one thing that I can digest. So I'd offer you to think about how can we challenge even when we think about this person's XYZ identities, take out the commas and see what does that do to think about that person not as Raja, the director of the center, but Raja, the director who happens to be genderqueer, and all those pieces as one, because we're not, and our identities are not, you can't, I think one of you had that beautiful quote, if you cut me in half, both sides bleed, right? And so you can't cut us into pieces, so I would offer you to think a little more complexly. I didn't hear a lot of folks talking about intersectionality around kind of Crenshaw or just any of the work around what does it mean to think about, I think you all talked about the political, the cultural, the socio-historical, the individual, but also think about some of the terminology that's been really cool for me, I think, in the way it's been able to actually talk about it's not just interpersonal or individual, but really socio-historical and political, and not always putting the onus of creating community and building community on the individuals, because we're already fighting systems that are, in the context and the environment that we're in, are built against us, right? And so to really put the onus on the institutions and the cultures and the context to change, to support us, not just require us to do the work all the time, because we already do all the work. And then the other piece for me is thinking about, Terrell Strayhorn has a whole piece around sense of belonging, actually has a book on sense of belonging, and really talks about these elements of belonging that really, which what I like is that it's not about identity development. It's not just about what I want you to get out of an experience, particularly within a college environment, because those notions of what you should get out have often been developed by white, cis, straight, Anglo-Saxon folks that said you should go to college for this long, and by the end of it you should get this. And so really talking about belonging really changes it and really creates I would say, a decolonial perspective of what do you need to feel like you belong and feel welcome and supported in this environment, and how do we create that for you, versus this is what you should get. If you don't get it, you're not ready for us, right? Then again, shifting the power dynamics of who has responsibility for creating belonging and healing and what that looks like, I think is kind of cool. And especially the spiritual piece, I think is really cool. And then I appreciate the way you all talked about the context of how and where and why, particularly given the current political climate, the healing work is more critical than ever. And yet we are, I think you talked about this, the doing, like the pacing of the work. It's so easy for us to say, well, I did this today, so I'm good, versus, okay, like I have a really hard time just sitting silently. So my challenge has been at least once a week to spend 10 minutes to sit and do nothing, not be on my phone, not watch TV, because so much of our work is wrapped up in what we do. Because I think as kind of living in environments that tell us we have to, like as queer brown folks, for me at least, we have to do so much more to be seen as legitimate or enough. And so decolonizing requires to say, I'm going to sit for 10 minutes and feel okay with that, and not feel like I have to, like, and allow for the criticism externally to not be internalized. And that's part of the healing, is building our shields, not as guards, but as more solid frames for our own growth, right? To be able to build our own trunks so that we can branch out better and heal better. Just some thoughts for you all. I know you all have a lot of questions and thoughts as well. Are there any questions for the panelists in this room? We have about, let's see. Oh, we have about 5 to 7 minutes or so. Questions, thoughts, feedback, insights, other references, right here in the back.
Hi, I enjoyed all the presentations. I have a question for Anthony. So, Anthony, you were talking about, breaking down different kinds of practices during your interviews, and I was curious if in your analysis or as you're developing this, are you going to talk more about some of the links to spirituality and religion? Because in your slides, like for example, when you were saying study time with other Black women, Alice Walker's Wilderness Theology immediately came to mind, right? And I was thinking, obviously, particularly with Black Lives Matter, right, when you're constantly facing Black death and Black annihilation and Black precarity, right, actually being able to see each other and love each other and spend time in the flesh with each other, right, is intensely powerful and I think therapeutic. And then you also at the top of your slide you mentioned self-reflection and mindfulness. Mm-hmm. And there's been so much work recently around mindfulness and meditation as having these kind of neurocognitive benefits, right? Like neuroscientists at Stanford are studying meditation in East Palo Alto with working class and immigrant kids, right? Who clearly seem to be suffering from kind of post-traumatic stress from just living in precarious conditions. So I was curious, as you develop this, are you going to talk more about some of these links between kind of religion and spiritual practice and self-care and kind of...
Yeah, thank you for the question and the recommendation. The short answer, well, yes. The short backstory is that this was my senior honors thesis with the generous help of the Mel Mays Undergraduate Fellowship. And because of the nature of my discipline, even when I first proposed this project, they were like, it's not sociological, which I ended up getting the departmental citations. I was like, hey, I showed you. But it was not seen as sociological to them. So I think I was trying to stay away from anything that was deemed as self-help, right, or deemed as too spiritual when I was doing it as an undergrad at Berkeley. However, in continuing the work, this is not what I'm going to be doing for my master's or my PhD, but it's something I want to continue to develop. And it is something I wanted to get into more, right? Because mindfulness, Angela Davis has written about it. Like you said, Alice Walker, June Jordan, a lot of Black women, women specifically have written about it. So the goal would be at some point to incorporate that in. There's also some quant data in there. And so there's links to other things that I can think about. But I agree. There's definitely the spirituality. Sometimes I mentioned that some women practice Ifa or another form of African spirituality. the thing that also I didn't mention was that they some of them were just like, I'm spiritual, right? Like it wasn't a specific thing, and that's like a whole nother set of questions that was another surprise that I didn't anticipate as much, because at the time I wasn't also as in tune with my own spiritual practice, and so then that was a blind spot as a researcher, right? So I think about that a lot, and about what Roger was saying of when I asked them about being black and being a woman and being a black woman, they're like, you can't separate them. It was the same thing, right? So what is that spirituality, and who can I? The bulk of the work in there was citing Patricia Hill Collins, but who else can I get outside of that, right? There's some Audre Lorde and other folks that backs up and reinforces, and that's already been said, right? Even from like Sojourner Truth and other folks. So yes, the answer is yes, but I felt a little trapped by white academia. So now I have to find the time to incorporate that back in. But thank you for noticing that.
Any other questions? Probably have time for maybe one more in the back. Yes? Yeah.
Parents and herself, and how it was sort of like her dad gave her a little more of an enthusiastic push. And you mentioned machismo, and I'm wondering if that has, and on the mom's part, that has to do with more of a sense of internalized misogyny as opposed to outright machismo, where she's kind of internalized this sort of men are able to be more outstanding. So I'm going to go ahead and parlay this or relate this to my daughter as she grows up. So how much of it is it, or maybe I hope you put some thought, or I don't know. Yeah, maybe you have.
Yeah, thank you for that. I hadn't thought about that. I think that not only is it
I'm not sure if you can hear me or not. But specifically in
which I forgot to mention, or I'm not sure if I did mention, they were
divorced. So I don't know if that. I feel like that had something to do with these like clashes against like which seemed like, oh well, her father was like more supportive, yet her mother was like, no, like you shouldn't like expect so much of yourself in that way. So I think it's a combination of things. But thank you for that. I think I will put more thought into it. And I think there's just so much to unpack there. I feel like, they're a first generation college student, and I feel like it's, a lot of things going on in their lives, like with their parents. And then always they felt like they had a stronger relationship with their father versus their mother. And then, those family difficulties within them not liking each other and just this whole divorce thing. So I think there is a lot to unpack there, but I think that definitely seems to be something that could be relevant there. But thank you for that.
So one of the things I was thinking about also is the role of queer ancestry that we often don't talk about, that we as queer people, particularly queer people of color, we do have intergenerational communities, and yet often I think because of the way our worlds are structured in biological ways, I think we often are considered like family, and healing often is connected to biological family. And yet so much of our healing, particularly as queer people, happens, for me, I remember being in college and grad school and really learning about queer ancestors, whether it was the Audre Lorde or the various other people across the world that have been and proudly queer in their own ways, and yet we often don't talk about them. And we often feel like queerness is only in us, and yet we often forget that, we give racial identity and cultural identity and class identity, all these things we connect to family and kind of lineages. We don't do that with queerness. Mm-hmm. And I think often part of our healing, for me at least, is understanding and embracing and even owning and embracing that intergenerational queerness in ways that I think can help us find a sense of community beyond even people that are in spirit versus in body. So just something to think about. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Please join me in a round of applause for this amazing scholar. And I'm sure these folks will be available if you have any one-on-one questions with them as well. Thank you.